Imagine the most powerful man on earth. He controls the largest army ever assembled. He commands the loyalty of 1,000,000 soldiers spread across 3 continents. Entire nations send him tribute. Kings beg for his approval. Poets write that the gods themselves bow to his name. He has survived assassination attempts, civil wars, and enemies that would have broken lesser men into pieces. And then one night, in a marble palace at the heart of the world, 23 men surround him with knives. He sees the blade of his closest friend among them, and according to the historians who recorded that moment, he couldn't utter a word. He decided to pull his toga over his face so that he will not be seen dying undignified. He then falls slowly on the floor after being struck by his so-called friend's blade. That was Julius Caesar, the man who made Rome an empire and who was painfully killed by the same republic he was trying to save, or maybe destroy, depending on who you ask. This is the true story of Rome. 1,000 years of power, blood, and betrayal. And it began not with a god, not with a great king, not with a glorious battle, but with 2 brothers, a she-wolf, and a murder that set the pattern for everything that came after. The legends of history says Romulus and Remus were abandoned as infants on the banks of the Tiber River and were found and fed by a wolf. This wolf kept them alive when the world had decided they should die, but they surprisingly grew up into warriors. They founded a city together on the 7 hills above the river and argued about which hill the city should be centered on. This argument became a fight, and the fight resulted into something more darker, leading Romulus to kill his own brother Remus. This made the first act of Roman history to be fratricide and resulted in the city being built on the blood of an indigenous family. The civil wars, the assassinations, the emperors who killed their own mothers and sons and wives all began at this point. So, truth is, Rome was born violent, and it never entirely grew out of it. The early city was small, scrappy, and surrounded by enemies who were bigger, older, and far better organized. The Etruscans to the north were sophisticated and powerful. The Latin tribes around the Etruscans were hostile. Everyone, including the Sabines, the Samnites, the Greeks in the south, had a reason to want this new settlement on the Tiber crushed before it became a problem. Rome had one answer to all of them. This answer was nothing but war, because the constant, relentless will exhaustingly determine war. But Rome was also something the ancient world had rarely seen before. It was adaptable to the extent that when it defeated an enemy, it didn't just loot them and leave, it absorbed them, gave them rights, and made them Roman. When it encountered a military tactic that worked better than its own, it copied it immediately and used it against the next enemy. When its government structure stopped working, it reformed it not smoothly and not without crisis. Rome was a civilization that learned from failure faster than almost any other in history. For the first few centuries, Rome was a republic, and power was shared in theory. 2 consuls were elected every year, and each has the power to veto the other. There was a senate of aristocrats who debated, plotted, and governed with the kind of passionate intensity that only men with everything to lose can manage. Beneath the Senate were the people and the plebeians who fought Rome's wars, paid Rome's taxes, and spent generations demanding a share of the power their blood had purchased. This was messy, contentious, and often brutal, but it worked. The Republic expanded steadily. The southward absorbed the Italian peninsula piece by piece. By 264 BC, Rome controlled most of the boot, looked across the narrow strip of water separating Sicily from North Africa, and saw Carthage. Carthage was everything Rome wanted to be and secretly feared it wasn't. It was rich beyond imagination and the master of the Mediterranean trade routes. It was also in command of a navy that made Rome's look like fishing boats. Carthage had been a great power for 500 years before Rome was even a significant city. These 2 civilizations, one old money, one new hunger, were on a collision course that would shake the ancient world to its foundations. This collision between the civilization resulted in the Punic Wars, which lasted over a century. It ended in 3 separate conflicts where tens of thousands died on both sides. Rome lost its entire fleets to storms. It rebuilt them and lost them again and rebuilt them again for the 3rd time. The sheer stubbornness of Rome is almost difficult to believe, because in most civilizations, after losing 50,000 men in a single battle, would negotiate, but Rome rather recruited more soldiers. Carthage then sent Hannibal, who was one of the most extraordinary military commanders in human history. In 218 BC, he marched an army, including war elephants, across southern Spain, through the Alps in winter, into northern Italy. These crossings alone killed thousands of his men and most of his elephants. What arrived in Italy was battered, frostbitten, and outnumbered. For 15 years, Hannibal ran circles around every Roman army sent against him. He destroyed them at the Trebia River and annihilated them at Lake Trasimene. At Cannae, in 216 BC, he killed between 50,000 and 70,000 Roman soldiers in a single afternoon. This became the bloodiest day in Rome's history and one of the most tactically perfect battles ever fought. This made Rome fall on its knees completely. All the same, Rome did not still break. The Senate met and made a decision that was either insane or genius, depending on how you look at it. They refused to negotiate. They rather kept fighting. They grounded Hannibal down for over 15 years in Italy, denying him the decisive victory he needed, until finally a Roman general named Scipio took the war to Carthage itself. There, Hannibal was called home to defend his city at the Battle of Zama in 202 BC, and Scipio defeated him. That made Carthage to surrender. 50 years later, the message was not subtle. Rome burned Carthage to the ground, salted the earth, and sold its surviving citizens into slavery to send a strong signal that this is what happens to civilizations that threaten Rome. By the 1st century BC, Rome controlled the entire Mediterranean world. This made Egypt to pay tribute, Greece became a province, and Spain, North Africa, Asia Minor, all became Roman. It turned the Republic into something it was never designed to handle. It became an empire in everything but name and governed by institutions built for a city-state. The cracks were showing everywhere. This made the gap between rich and poor had become a chasm. Generals with loyal armies were more powerful than elected officials. Politicians hired street gangs, the courts were bought. The Senate was paralyzed by faction and personal ambition. This chaos walked 3 men who between them would tear the Republic apart and remake the world. There came the richest man in Rome, Crassus. He was a man who made his fortune by letting buildings burn until their owners saw their property turn to ash and agreed to sell it to him for almost nothing. He was also a man with so much money to the extent that he could fund armies, buy elections, and reshape politics. But he discovered too late that money could not buy military genius. The Mediterranean of pirates was cleared in 3 months by General Pompey when everyone said it would take years. Pompey was the conqueror of the East, very charming, handsome, and well celebrated. He was the kind of man who made crowds cheer simply by appearing. A man who believed his own reputation so completely that he never quite prepared for someone better. Then came Julius Caesar, who was brilliant, reckless, and magnetic. He was so deeply in debt in his 30s that his creditors tried to stop him leaving Rome for his provincial command. He turned a small posting in Gaul into one of the most savage and brilliant military campaigns in history. He also conquered modern-day France and Belgium and crossed into Britain for a good measure. The reports he sent back to Rome were so vivid and well-written that ordinary citizens read them like stories. He then built a personal army of fanatically loyal veterans and then stood at the bank of a small river called the Rubicon and made a decision that would change the world. Crossing the Rubicon with an army was treason, and every Roman general knew that. The law was absolute, and you have to disband your army before crossing back into Italy. To cross armed was to declare war on the Republic itself. Caesar crossed armed, and the civil war that followed ended up killing Pompey on an Egyptian beach, stabbed by men he thought were allies. Crassus had already died years earlier in Mesopotamia, and his army were destroyed by Parthian horse archers. His severed head was used as a prop in a Greek play. This made Caesar stand alone at the top of the Roman world. Caesar was stabbed 23 times in the theatre of Pompey on the Ides of March, 44 BC. The conspirators called themselves liberators. They believed that killing Caesar would restore the Republic, but instead it ignited another civil war, and from the wreckage of that war, one man emerged called Augustus Caesar. Augustus Caesar was Julius's adopted son. He was a man who learned from his father's mistakes and made none of them. Where Julius had been openly ambitious, Augustus chose to be subtle. He never called himself king and never for once called himself a dictator. He called himself simply the first citizen, the princeps. He kept the Senate, kept the elections, kept all the old republican forms, and just made sure that every meaningful decision went through him. This approach became the cleverest political maneuver in Roman history. Under Augustus, Rome entered its golden age. The borders were secured, 50,000 miles of roads were built, which were so well constructed that some are still visible today, 2,000 years later. Augustus boasted that he found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. For once, the boast was not an exaggeration. Then came the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, who lasted for only 2 centuries. Trade flowed. During this time, cities grew, and art, architecture, literature, and law all flourished under the stability Rome provided. From Hadrian's Wall in northern Britain to the deserts of Mesopotamia, there was only one government, one legal system, one currency, and one language of power that connected the entire known world. Nothing like it had existed before, and nothing quite like it would exist again for over 1,000 years. But power without accountability rots from the inside, and the emperors who followed Augustus ranged from the merely mediocre to the genuinely terrifying. Tiberius, Augustus's successor, was capable but deeply paranoid. He spent the last decade of his reign on the island of Capri, ruling by letter, while his trusted prefect Sejanus ran Rome and eliminated anyone who might threaten his master's position. Next was Caligula. He ruled for 4 years and managed in that time to empty the treasury, murder his own family members, declare himself a living god, and conduct a military campaign against the ocean. He literally ordered his soldiers to collect seashells as spoils of war against Neptune. But he was assassinated by his own Praetorian Guard. His uncle Claudius was found hiding behind a curtain in the palace during the chaos and was declared emperor on the spot. Claudius was smarter than anyone gave him credit for. He conquered Britain. He reformed the civil service. But unfortunately, his wife Agrippina allegedly poisoned him with mushrooms in order to put her son Nero on the throne. Nero started promisingly. He was young, enthusiastic, genuinely interested in art and performance. He surprisingly had his mother, his first wife, and his second wife all killed. He also kicked his pregnant third wife to death during an argument and blamed the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD on the Christians by launching the first systematic persecution of a religion that would eventually outlast the empire itself. He stripped the treasury to build himself a palace that was so enormous that it had a lake where the Colosseum now stands. When the legions finally rose against him, he fled Rome and had a servant help him stab himself, weeping that the world was losing a great artist. The year of the 4 emperors followed. At 69 AD, 4 men claimed the throne, in which 3 died. The 4th one, who was Vespasian, brought stability and began the Flavian dynasty. His son Titus completed the siege of Jerusalem by destroying the Second Temple and bringing thousands of Jewish slaves back to Rome to build the Colosseum. His other son Domitian ruled competently but with growing cruelty until his own wife helped organize his assassination. And then, mercifully, Rome got lucky by the introduction of the 5 good emperors, namely Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius. There were 5 consecutive rulers, spanning nearly a century, who were chosen on merit rather than birth, who governed with intelligence and restraint, and pushed Rome to its greatest territorial extent, which ended up as the most sophisticated administrative achievement. Edward Gibbon, the great historian of Rome's decline, wrote that this was the period in human history when the condition of the human race was most happy and prosperous. Trajan pushed the empire to its absolute maximum by crossing the Danube to conquer Dacia and pushing east into Mesopotamia by standing at the Persian Gulf. Hadrian pulled back, consolidated, and built the wall in northern Britain that still bears his name till now. Marcus Aurelius also governed while fighting almost constant wars on multiple fronts and writing his private philosophical journal at night in his military tent. This private philosophical journal became the book we now call the Meditations. Its words were so honest and so human that people still read them as a guide to life 2,000 years later. Marcus Aurelius made one fatal mistake. He had a son named Commodus who was everything his father was not. He was vain, cruel, and delusional to the extent that he renamed Rome and the months after himself. He appeared in the Colosseum as a gladiator who was against crippled opponents, terrified animals, and expected the crowds to worship him as Hercules reborn. This made his own household to eventually strangle him in his bath on New Year's Eve in 192 AD. This began a slow unraveling, and what followed was a century of crisis for 50 years in which Rome had over 50 emperors. Most of them were being killed by the soldiers who had just elevated them. This made the borders to be frayed and the currency to be debased until inflation made it nearly worthless. Plague swept through the empire twice, which killed millions of people, and the roads crumbled in places no one had money to repair. The administrative genius that had held the empire together began to break down under the weight of its own complexity. Diocletian tried to save the empire by splitting it in two, an Eastern and Western empire, each with its own emperor, and each governing a more manageable portion of the whole. Constantine reunited it briefly in the early 4th century. He also did something no one saw coming. He converted the empire to Christianity. The religion Nero had tried to exterminate had survived, spread, and quietly woven itself into the fabric of Roman society. Constantine didn't just tolerate it, he made it the empire's favored faith, where the cross replaced the eagle on Roman standards. This Christian faith, born in a conquered province, became the official religion of the empire that had crucified its founder. History does not lack for irony, so even Constantine's genius and Christianity's moral cohesion could not stop what was coming from beyond the borders. The Huns arrived from Central Asia in the late 4th century. They were nomadic people of extraordinary ferocity and mobility who shattered the settled Germanic tribes along the Rhine and Danube, sending them crashing into Roman territory not as raiders, but as desperate refugees. The Visigoths begged Rome to let them cross the Danube. Rome let them in, and the Roman officials treated them so corruptly and so brutally that they revolted. At the Battle of Adrianople in 378 AD, the Visigoths annihilated a Roman army and killed the Eastern Emperor Valens. This became a wound Rome will never fully recover from. The Western Empire began filling in with Germanic federates, soldiers who later fought for Rome but owed their loyalty to their own chiefs. The real power increasingly resided not with emperors, but with these military strongmen. The emperors became figureheads, and children on thrones were managed by generals who saw no reason to bother maintaining even the pretense any longer. On September 4th, 476 AD, a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer walked into the palace in Ravenna and told the last Western Roman emperor, who was a 16-year-old boy named Romulus Augustulus. He was named after both the city's legendary founder and its first emperor, that his services were no longer required. He was sent into comfortable exile in a castle in Campania with no battle, no dramatic last stand, and not even a particularly heated argument. This move ended the Western Roman Empire not with a catastrophic final war, but with a polite administrative dismissal. But here is what the history books sometimes forget to tell you. After 1,000 years of power, blood, and betrayal, Rome did not entirely die. The Eastern Empire became what historians call Byzantium and survived for another 1,000 years, while preserving its Roman law, Roman culture, and its Roman identity in Constantinople until 1453 AD. Roman law became the backbone of most modern legal systems, and the Romance languages in French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, Romanian are all daughters of Latin. The Catholic Church preserved Roman administrative structures when everything else collapsed. The word emperor comes from the Latin imperator. The word Senate still names legislative bodies across the world, and every time a modern nation builds a courthouse with columns on the front, it is unconsciously quoting Rome. Always remember, the empire fell, but the idea never did. To refuse, even in death, to entirely disappear, to leave something so deep in the foundations of the world that 2,000 years later, we are still living inside it and still governed by its laws, still speaking fragments of its language, still building our civic buildings to look like its temples, means truly the idea never fell. Romulus killed Remus and built a city on the blood of his own brother. And that city became violent, brilliant, ruthless, and magnificent. It looked at the entire world and decided it wasn't big enough. It almost wasn't wrong.